And good afternoon, everyone. I guess except for those of you on the West Coast, in which case it'd be good morning still. Welcome from St. Louis, Missouri, in the home of the Missouri Institute of Mental Health. My name's Tom Pansella from MIMH. I'm glad that you could join us, and I'm glad that at the beginning of the new fiscal year, we're still here to present these programs. So welcome, everyone. I'll introduce our speaker to you in just a moment. If this is the first time you're joining us, we're glad you're here. If you've been to these before, welcome back. As always, we encourage you to give us questions or comments. Use the Questions for Speaker link underneath the video window. That will submit your question to us via email. We're going to hold the questions till the end of the presentation portion of the program and ask them on your behalf at that time. But please submit them at any time during the program. Also, if you're interested in CEUs for the program, there's a link for CEUs underneath that video window as well. Click on that link and you can purchase CEUs. That's a $10 fee, but it's only $10 per person for CEUs for this program. Also, if you'd like to see Lee Judy slides at any time in a separate pop-up window rather than just in the video window, there is a link to those as well. And finally, there's a link if you're interested in a suicide prevention conference that's coming up, a live conference on July 29th and 30th. Information about that's available as well. That's going to be in mid-Missouri at the end of this month. And so, Lee Judy, he started his crisis intervention work about 30 years ago as the Executive Director of Life Crisis Services in St. Louis here, where he worked for 15 years. Since then, he's been involved in national suicide prevention work with the American Association of Suicidology, and now with the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, where he was recently the Director of Standards, Training, and Practice, and is now focusing on his attention to continuity of care issues. And Lee, thank you for joining us today.
You're welcome, Tom.
And the floor is yours.
All right, thank you. Let me begin by saying that I think by the time I finished my tour with Life Crisis, I really thought that I had a good background in suicide prevention, knew kind of current thinking about it. And in the last 15 years of my career, I've really been proven wrong with that assumption. I've learned a tremendous amount while working at the American Association of Suicidology and now at the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. And it's my latter experience that I want particularly to share with you, because I think what is being done there is cutting-edge information. It was not available to me as the Executive Director of Life Crisis Services, not available to crisis centers in general, and I think will be useful to you in your practice, either as a mental health professional, seeing individual clients, in group work, in crisis work. I hope you will direct your questions to me from your own perspective, and I'll try to answer them from that perspective. So let me tell you a little bit about the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. This is a nationally funded project, and it's funded by the federal government Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration. And there are two numbers that this particular project covers: 800-273-TALK, which is 8255, and then 800-SUICIDE. The idea when SAMHSA first started funding this project was, wouldn't it be nice if there were an 800 number or a free number for people to call anywhere in the United States and to be directed to an experienced crisis worker in their area. And so initially the work was to figure out, was that technically possible? It turns out that it was. And so now it is possible for anybody to call anywhere, and their call is routed by area code to the nearest crisis center. There are over 147 crisis centers in our network. It is the only glitch with any of this process is our cell phones, because if you purchase a cell phone with a different area code, you might, for example, I had a call last week from a woman who had lived in Kansas and moved to Oregon and still had a Kansas mobile phone. But in general, you're going to get the crisis center closest to you, and in all cases, you're going to get a crisis center that is experienced in handling people's calls who are suicidal or are just struggling with life. Let me just say something before I go on to this. In fact, I'll go back to this slide so you don't get distracted by it. The National Suicide Prevention Lifeline's offices are in New York City. It's made up of some separate divisions that have important functions for the kind of the wherewithal of this project. One is a network division that's responsible actually for building the network. There's an IT division, as you might imagine, with all of this technical work that we're doing, and a standards training and practices division, which is really focused on the standards and, just like the name says, and practices of the operating crisis centers. Now, the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline does not do accreditation. We do not have authority over any of these crisis centers, except that they contract with us to be a part of our network. So what we have to do then is to think about what, as a kind of a non-influencing body, but a member, but an overseer of this network, can we do to help our crisis centers answer the calls with some uniformity, with a quality that is consistent with good practice, and so that the organization of the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline is really geared to being able to do that kind of thing. In the course of Lifeline's work, there are some values that have been developed that we really are expecting all of our crisis centers to follow. Each crisis center in our network, and those of you who work in crisis centers certainly know this, but those of you who may not know this, that all 147 of these centers are independent. Some started 40, 50 years ago. Many of them use volunteers, a lot of them use staff, but they all are independent, run their own organizations. So it's even more important that we try to do something that would help further the field, but to make sure that if you're calling from Vermont, the center you get there is going to deal with you, do your risk assessment in a similar way as the center in Florida or the one in California. So one of the first things that Lifeline did was to try to determine what are core values that we want our centers to stand for. And none of this, in fact, much of what I'm going to present today is not kind of new in terms of thinking, and you'll say, oh, sure, good contact is something that I would expect, but it's surprising how many people, how many professionals in our field do not, in fact, practice good contact. A lot of our work is focused on, in that good contact, collaborating with the person we're working with, helping them to develop a plan of action, not developing that plan for them, and then intervening, particularly with suicidal people, in a way that's most helpful for the person at risk. We're also committed to evidence-based practice, and you might think, well, yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and everybody is trying to do that. But in the field of crisis work, there really is not much evidence-based practice. Some of it comes out of what I've already told you about the nature of these independent centers, and they've been small, many of them, and just not focused that way. And so the work that Lifeline has been doing since it began, and actually SAMHSA has helped a great deal in this regard, is to develop some evidence-based information that would then be able to be passed on to centers for practice. The center itself gets about 60,000 calls a month, which is a lot of calls. And those calls are as varied as any visits to your office or any calls to other crisis centers. But that's close to, in fact, we just handled our 2 millionth call. That's a lot of people that are using this network. So I think just on that basis alone, you could say that the idea that the federal government, that SAMHSA had in the beginning, that this would be a valuable resource for Americans is true. All the centers that are a part of the network are required to be accredited, either accredited by their state or accredited by someone like the American Association of Suicidology, Contact, the Alliance for Information Referral Services, COA, CARF, any of the people that are good at accrediting the Joint Commission, because we don't want to get into the accreditation business, but we want our centers to have met that fundamental standard. So all of them have to meet that standard. In addition, if you're going to be a Lifeline center, then you have to meet the standards that we set for practice. And I'm going to review our standards for practice, but I want to make sure that I'm going to review them because I think they're important, and I think they are, as much as this field knows, and I would welcome your questions about how you make them useful for your practice or what they can mean to you. The first thing I'm going to deal with is the essence of crisis intervention, which starts with this notion of good contact. One of the things that, I'm going to go back here a minute so we don't get distracted by that slide. The way Lifeline has formulated a lot of the information I'm going to be presenting is through the use of work groups or committees or subcommittees made up of experts. And in this first one, we're going to be dealing with the essence of crisis intervention. It's really was a work group that was formulated to answer the question if we were going to monitor calls between a person in crisis and someone who is a crisis worker. What would we want to listen to? How would we want to rate their performance? And so this is some of that information. Now, it has not been information that the centers that belong to Lifeline are required to use at this point. It's information that we're working with, but I thought you would like to know what we've come up with. Again, none of this is stuff that is different than you took when you went to school, nor that you're supposed to be practicing, but I thought it was interesting that this work group went back to these fundamentals when they were thinking of how would we want to measure a crisis worker's performance with a caller. So good contact, connection with the client, the caller, building an alliance, building rapport, and that there are three parts to that. There's an empathy part, there's matching the client's language and pace, and an authenticity. All these things kind of fit together. We tried to separate them in terms of individual topics. So empathy and the things that you know how to do, but that I unfortunately find many people forget to do. So it's reflecting back feelings, it's paraphrasing, it's creating this warm and genuine tone. And it is not judging this person who is calling with a load of different issues. It's not for you judging your clients. And oftentimes it's hard to do, but it sets back empathy so far when you do judge and don't accept. So these are the parts that this work group felt, you know, if you're going to set a tone that's going to be helpful to crisis intervention, you need to be thinking about these things. Similarly, and a part of building empathy is, this relationship, and Lifeline is about making this a collaborative relationship. The language that you use does not rush. It does not indicate that you want to be doing something else or want them to get on with things. You're staying engaged with the present. I know one of the, when I was at Life Crisis supervising students and staff, when I was at Washington University involved in the social work school, one of the challenges I think for most of us in this field who want to be helpful is to rush ahead to try to think about what they should be doing, and there aren't many clients that don't know you're rushing ahead and don't know that you've got an agenda of your own. So this is a part of, okay, you're using questions, you don't jump prematurely to problem solving, you stay engaged in the present, and in spite of the fact that you might want to move on, it's really giving this person the time that they deserve. And in terms of authenticity, so you might have a notion about how this call should go, you might have a script in your head, you might also think that, boy, if I tell them about myself, and I've been there, that'll be helpful, and sometimes it is, but generally not. Change the focus of this conversation. And what you want to do is exhibit trust and competence and confidence in them that they can deal with this problem. Okay, so that's kind of fundamental stuff. I don't want to spend a lot of time on that, and I'm sure that most of you do that and know that, but I wanted you to know that we're also, even today, with all of these professional people, we're still emphasizing those kinds of basic things. The first set of standards that Lifeline came up with were involving suicide risk assessment. So I'm going to review those standards with you now. And the reason that we developed these standards was in the beginning of this project, SAMHSA required that an evaluation study be done. And I think it was one of the most useful, productive, smart things to do. And there were two groups involved. One involved a group at Columbia and Rutgers. Another involved a study from Montreal. And both of these studies were looking at crisis center effectiveness. Now, up until this time, there really had not been any study that I would say anybody believed that, in fact, crisis centers had proven that they were effective. I knew it because I answered the calls and I knew what we did. And anybody who works on a crisis line or works with people knows that they're effective. But this was a study that was needed. So these two major studies published their results in June of 2007, and they both reported that crisis centers were effective. And I think that for crisis centers was an important finding. For SAMHSA it was an important finding because now crisis centers could be incorporated into the mainstream delivery of mental health services, which everybody wasn't so sure about. So very important work, very critical, I think, to mental health care in general. And any of you who are listening to this need to think about how you can, in fact, use your crisis center in a most effective way in your practice. So from the one study, this was John Califat at the University of Rutgers and Madeline Gould at the University of Columbia. They found, and in both of these studies, calls were monitored. So they found significant reductions in crisis and suicidal status occurred during the calls. That's very hopeful and what you would want. And in fact, 12% of the callers said that the call prevented them from killing themselves. Well, that's certainly a good result when you're thinking about suicide prevention. This is from Brian Mashera, who studied this from Canada. Centers had helped a significant number of callers. By the end of the call, 52% were less confused, 49% were less helpless, 40% were more hopeful. Well, that's the kind of thing all of you as therapists would hope to be doing with your clients as well. However, in the first study, and Jimmy Lou Monkfa was a part of that study, was not on my original slide, reported at 6.5%, and they listened to 801 callers. So that's a lot of people, silently monitored. No one knew that the caller did not know, a crisis worker did not know, that they had suicidal thoughts, and yet the crisis center had not asked them about that. Well, you know, there are lots of possible reasons for that. It could be they just weren't forthcoming. It could be they didn't realize they had them, but it also could be that the crisis center didn't ask. So that was an important finding for us. And then Brian reported, and he monitored 1,431 calls. 723 were not asked about suicide. And of the 474 callers who reported suicidal thought, no questions about means were asked, which is kind of a question you think is a pretty important one. When someone says they're suicidal, you want to know, well, do they have the means to do that? So these findings prompted the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline to say, you know what, I think we need to take a look at our suicide assessment standards and make sure that our centers uniformly approach this question. And for 2 years, a subcommittee chaired by Dr. Thomas Joyner, but also made up of many good researchers, clinicians, crisis centers, tried to figure out how to do this. Studied all the available risk assessments, and you know that there are many of those. Tried to come up with something that would be useful and reflect what is most commonly known now. And there were 3 areas general areas, and I'm going to talk about each of these in more detail. First of all, that a person who's calling, you can make an assumption if they're calling a suicide hotline that you need to ask them about suicide. So that prompt questions were suggested and required actually by Lifeline of all of its centers. And that there were some ways to organize suicidal thinking and suicidal behavior, and I'm going to talk about those and some subcomponents that were also part of that. So one of these questions is required, and all of our 147 centers have suicide risk assessment standards, instruments that meet our standards and that ask these questions. Have to be asked. Every Lifeline caller has to be asked, are you thinking about suicide? Have you thought about suicide in the last 2 months, or have you ever attempted suicide? Now, if the first question gets a yes, you don't necessarily need to do the others. In fact, you want to find out how urgent is this current thinking. But someone says, no, I never really haven't thought about suicide, and maybe because they're reluctant to talk about the subject, and an easier way to get at kind of their thinking about suicide might be to ask the other 2 questions. Were you ever attempted before? Or last 2 months, given all that you've been struggling with, you ever thought about suicide? And that then will lead you and them to being more honest about where they are with suicide. After the subcommittee met, they thought about organizing a suicidal risk assessment in 4 different areas: suicidal desire, capability, intent, and buffers. These were new categories to me, and I had, as being a part of Life Crisis, had thought we did a pretty good assessment of suicide risk, and it's based on a lot of kind of what had been passed on to me, but no one had ever helped me to organize my thinking in this particular way. Suicidal desire. So that is the pain that the person is feeling that they might want to end by killing themselves. So how strong is this desire? Apart, and these are subcomponents, these are the kinds of things that you need to be thinking about and assessing to find out about suicidal desire. So someone can say that they're thinking about suicide, but really not feel the pain enough to want to kill themselves. But if they are telling you, you know, this pain is, I mean, it's so strong, it feels like a physical pain, I just want it to go away, or they're feeling, I'm hopeless or helpless, or yeah, people be better off without me, I feel trapped, I don't know where to go, or, and it's not just being alone, it's being intolerably alone, that this pain that I feel as a result of being alone is so great that it adds to this desire. So if you use these subcomponents and you get a kind of a positive, or in this case really a negative feeling from this person about, man, I'm really struggling, then you could say they have strong suicidal desire. The next category is suicidal capability, which is, okay, do they have the psychological ability to actually kill themselves? Is there something going on with them, something about their history, something about their makeup that will make this act possible? Because this is not an easy thing to do, and people know when they're thinking about suicide, oh man, I'm not so sure. So this is about how capable are they. So here are the subcomponents of capability. Have they attempted before? And it would make sense if somebody has attempted before that it might be easier for them to attempt again. So they are then more capable. Exposure to someone else's death by suicide. So let's say you had a good friend that killed themselves. You might, as a result, be more capable because, well, I know somebody else who did it and they seem to be doing okay. And so those two things are kind of illustrative of what this category means in terms of capability. History of violence and current violence are both measurements. I'll go to the current violence is really here at the end, recent acts and threats of aggression. So historical behavior can predict future behavior, but current behavior is also important. So is this a violent person? It takes some violence to kill yourself. Same thing with intoxication and use of substances. A history could predict a future use, but current use also is an indicator of risk and makes you more capable. If in fact you are intoxicated, you may not have the same fear that you would if you were not intoxicated. Certainly, means of hurting yourself is a part of this capability. If you don't have the means, you're really not capable, so capable of killing. Doesn't mean that you won't, but... And then these, when I was at Life Crisis, I used to think, because it was known that if you had a psychiatric illness, that you were more at risk. But there are lots of people with a psychiatric illness that do not attempt suicide. So what is it about people who are depressed, for example, that might make them more at risk for suicide, or people that have had a loss, or people that are in trouble or something? What is it? Well, one of them has to do with the pain that they're feeling, so that's under suicidal desire. Another is the mood change that they're feeling a recent and a dramatic one? Not just back and forth mood changes, which are bad, but it's a recent dramatic mood. It's an increase in anxiety. It's a decrease in sleep. It's being out of touch with reality. All of those pieces about psychiatric illness might make a person more capable. It doesn't mean that they will kill themselves. None of these things do, and it doesn't mean that if they have all these things or they don't have them, that they won't kill themselves. But what we're trying to do is provide good current information to crisis centers so, in fact, they would not miss somebody that they were talking to who might need extra help. Then there's suicidal intent. These are four subcomponents are more obvious. Attempt in progress, well, you've got an intent there. A plan, you have an intent there. Preparatory behaviors, less obvious, but when you think about it, yeah, someone who's given away stuff, made a will, that kind of thing. An expressed intent to die. So what is the reason that you're thinking about suicide? You really want to die from that? And so that's a part of the whole area of suicidal intent. And then there's this buffers connectedness, which kind of everybody had a sense about, but no one really had put in a category. So these are the subcomponents of buffers. Immediate support. somebody there with you now. And this would be true for a telephone call, but for those of you who are working face-to-face with somebody, the rest of these things are important. Social supports, planning for the future, engagement with you, the helper or the telephone crisis worker, an ambivalence for living, dying, a set of values, core values and beliefs that, no, you know, I promised my mom I'd never do this, or I would always take care of this dog. Those kinds of things that might kind of mitigate this suicidal thinking. And then a sense of purpose, like feeling, well, I don't think my kids could deal with my killing myself. So when you look at all of those, and if those are positive, then you could say that the buffers or connectedness of this person are positive. So this subcommittee then suggested that this is a way to think about assessing risk using these core principles and subcomponents. If suicidal desire and capability and intent are high, then the role of buffers is minimal. So you can have lots of positive things, but if you're really in a lot of pain and you're capable and your intent is to die, then you could be considered to be at high risk. Doesn't mean that you're not at high risk if you don't meet those things, but you know, this is more of a kind of helpful indicator for you. And actually, as clinicians, when you're talking to people, you always ought to ask them about suicide, for one thing. You're not any different than a crisis worker. And the people that say no to your question about, no, I'm not thinking about suicide, but you know because they present to you this terrible story of how much they're suffering. You need to be thinking about, wait a minute, sounds like they're hopeless. I think I need to explore desire a little bit. I wonder, they talk about abusing substances and not sleeping well. I need to explore capability. So these categories for you ought to come to mind as you're working with people. Moderate to high risk, if desire and intent are present, but not capability. If desire and capability are present, then the risk level is moderated by the buffers, because you've got a category missing, and the buffers then can have a positive impact on their risk level. And if it's desire, capability, intent alone, then the risk level is moderated by the buffers. And in all these cases, it's your judgment about how you feel about this, but these are meant to be additional tools. The other area that Lifeline is proposing guidelines and policies for has to do with people at imminent risk, people that really are thinking about ending their life. These policies and guidelines will probably be published in the fall of this year and have to do with guiding the crisis centers to do some of the things I've already talked about, to collaborate with the person at risk, to be practicing the least invasive behavior, and to be following up with them to make sure they're okay. There are 9 supporting guidelines. I've not included them all in here because some of them just don't apply to this situation, but apply to this presentation, but apply to crisis centers. And of course, a part of implementing a rescue for someone at risk involves having a relationship with people that do that. So we promote taking all action necessary, being least invasive, and collaborating with community resources. I'll let you read through that. Definition of imminent risk is what you might imagine. Now, this has to do with how are you engaging these people at imminent risk. This is already somebody who you think is at serious risk for hurting themselves. You still want to engage them, you still want to develop rapport, and you still want to develop their collaboration. And this is a joint venture with them, even though they may be more out of control. There's a definition of active engagement. This particular piece I think is important about least invasive intervention because it's not something that I was automatically thinking about when I was at life crisis. That you, the person who is suicidal, we want to help you get help for yourself. That's the most effective way to do it. We need to work extra hard at doing that instead of saying, okay, I'm calling the police or I'm calling 911. That it's more about helping you in the least invasive way, honoring your wishes and desires to get help. There are some ways that might be accomplished. So this applies to you as clinicians wanting to help your client do this, knowing eventually you may have to take action, but it's better to spend some time developing this collaboration. Attempts in progress, you're going to have to act. And active rescue for us is a part of that process. And here's a definition of active rescue where we're saying, okay, comes down to this, you're not willing to do anything on your own. We've really worked hard at collaboration of trying to get you to develop a plan, but you're telling me that you're going to end it, then I got to do something. And here's what I'm going to do. Now, a group of people that I think most of us don't pay enough attention to are third-party people. These are people that you hear about from somebody else. A call perhaps saying that I'm worried about Joe because he's just not acting himself. Or you get a letter from somebody, or your client is telling you that their mother is really suicidal. So I think it's easy to let go of those people because they're really not our clients, we could say. But I think they're gifts to us as clinicians. I think those are the people that may not be feeling ambivalent and may be letting someone know indirectly that they're thinking about suicide and we need to do something with them. So we want to actively engage and are recommending to our centers, they actively engage third-party people. I'm recommending to you that you actively engage anybody you hear about who is suicidal. And that might be helping this person you're talking to be an intervener and collaborate with you. It might be a three-way call. It might be you calling a hotline with them. And this last piece here of removing access to weapons and so on, that would be a part of getting this third party to be kind of your representative. I put it in here because it's a part of our policy and guidelines, but I think it's an area that we aren't as aggressive about as we should be. And then here's another area that I think is useful for us as clinicians and crisis workers. What actually happened and how can we help a person who we sent to the emergency room, and when they got there they denied that they were suicidal and the emergency room let them go, which they had to do, and now they're back home. Do we follow up with those people? And we should. I mean, who else is going to follow up with them? So that we think about this suicidal behavior as being kind of on a continuum, but we have an obligation to continue to work with them. And I think it has, in my experience, become easy to hide behind HIPAA and for an emergency room to say, well, we don't share that information, or police. But none of that applies to somebody who is in a life-threatening situation. So we all need to get smarter about helping someone who was at risk and may still be at risk. And then to follow up if we need to. Before I'm out of time here, I want to talk about one other area. It has to do with an interest of lifelines and of our centers, and I think it's a treatment area that needs more attention, both at the crisis center level and at the clinician level. It has to do with following up with people. We had a work group that looked at follow-up. What does the literature say about follow-up? There's not a lot of literature, except that what we know is that people who go to the emergency room don't often go for treatment. People that we talk to on the phones and make referrals for don't often do what they say they're going to do or we think they should do. So this need to continue to follow them is even more important. And there are two pieces to the follow-up process that's important. So let's say you're a clinician and someone calls you and you have a policy of you can call me if you're suicidal, and they do, and you assess their risk. You might use those subcomponents or some other assessment of your own. But then the next part is to develop a safety plan with them. We're all about keeping our clients safe, but most of us don't have a plan for doing that. So this work group said that if we're going to be effective in follow-ups, then we need to have two things we're doing. One is this risk assessment on a regular basis every time we follow up, and the other is a safety plan, which we check on every time we follow up. There are a couple of safety plans that we are working with and recommend to our centers that I thought you ought to know about. One, it was developed by Barbara Stanley and Greg Brown. Barbara's at Columbia, Greg at University of Pennsylvania. And it is about thinking about how to keep somebody safe. Again, it's a very collaborative plan. I'm going to run through this briefly because I want to leave time for your questions. The safety planning in general of Barbara and Greg's is a list of coping strategies, gives this person a sense of control, provides a brief, easy-to-read format that uses a caller's words. So if you're working with them in your office, this is a safety plan you can develop and they can take home with them. And it can serve to motivate people to get this treatment that history shows that they don't get. So here are the steps of the safety plan. I'm going to do this very briefly. You can read them. So it has to do with things you know you would do anyway, contacting other mental health professionals, but a lot about internal strategies, family members. What do they do when they have, what have they done in the past when they've struggled, and how can they do that again? And then setting up a plan for doing that so that then when you do your recontact with them, you can say, well, let's talk about your safety plan. As I remember, this is what it was, and let's go through that. What hasn't worked? What has worked? What do you need to change? And then do a risk assessment. The other, oops, went the wrong way. The other plan is called Safe Plan, developed by Living Works, who has developed the ASSIST suicide prevention model. And it has a similar gist to it about keeping safe, making a safety contract, not using alcohol, drugs, linking to resources, disabling a plan, something about easing the pain. So some similar kinds of things. So I'd like to stop at this point. A lot of information for you. I want to give you a chance to ask questions about any of the things that I have presented to you. Appreciate your tuning in and watching this. I'm hopeful that it was new information, helpful information, practical information. That's what it's intended to be, and what we at Lifeline are intending to do with our crisis centers that are part of the network. Make sure that you and your clients know about 800-273-TALK number. Use it as a backup resource for them always.
All right. I'd like to give people a moment to send in some questions to us. Please use that speaker question link underneath the video window. Please submit your questions now via email. Also, a quick reminder, if you're interested in CEUs for the program, that link's available as well as our speaker slides. They're underneath that video window as well if you need to take a look back through them or read some of the things that he paused on to take a look at those. So give you just a moment to ask some questions, or if you're interested in that suicide prevention conference, that link's there as well. And we'll take a look here to see if anybody's submitted anything to us at this point. Any questions? You must have done a very thorough job. I don't see anything coming in at the moment. Got any other comments you'd like to add in here at this point?
It's a very generous conclusion. Yeah, just glad that you bothered to take the time for this. Want you to know that Lifeline's committed to continuing to work in this area. Our business is about suicide prevention. And if at any point you wonder about something in this field, why, certainly contact me, and if I'm not working on it, somebody else there will be.
And we waited just long enough.
All right.
All right. She says, do you know if these same steps or plans are effective with the terminally ill population who may be depressed or higher risk for suicide?
Absolutely. I assume by steps you're talking about the follow-up safety plan steps. And when you think about anybody at risk, if you're wanting to keep them safe, then the things well, let's just go back here for a minute to these, and maybe I can. Let's take a look at these. So you have a terminally ill client that you're working with, and you're worried about their being suicidal, and you worried about that because you've done a risk assessment, and they've really talked about it, and they have maybe some kind of plan, but you're thinking, the desire because of the terminal illness, they've got the capability because of this illness too, but other things might be going on, intent. Yeah, they're pretty alone. So you're thinking, okay, I've got someone that's at risk here, and then you are going to be saying to them, how is it that you recognize when you're thinking about suicide? What are your warning signs? And then you, working with this client, might write that out. Okay, here are the warning signs. Or you might get them to write out even better. Employing internal coping strategies without needing to contact another person. So what have you done in the past since you've been sick and feeling really not good? Have made you feel better? What have you been able to do? It might be music, TV, it might be reading, it might be talking to somebody, but most everybody has something that I just get up, I just walk. Socializing with others who may offer support. All right, anybody, and this is not family, this is somebody else, but then there's the family members. What is it you're thinking about doing to kill yourself? What's your plan? Oh, with a gun, okay. Any way of your giving that gun to a friend and reducing the means. So there isn't any of these steps that could not be used for anybody who's thinking about suicide, be they terminally ill or somebody who is struggling because of their marriage or some other issue.
All right, I've got a couple more here. And these two probably kind of correlate. She asks if there's any way to trace cell phones, and you might touch on the GPS technology that's built into them now. And then what do you do if a caller is unwilling to safety plan, get help, and doesn't give you any information so that the police can find them?
Don't like those. There isn't anything to do about cell phones still. It has gotten better. Lifeline is working with the National Emergency Number Association to try to, and with other groups, to try to make it possible for us to use the GPS information to track people, but that is not the case now. And so we really have to rely then on a caller. You'd have to rely on someone calling you to tell you where they are. And even if you have a cell phone, if you find an address and don't have GPS information, you don't know where they are. When you get somebody who is determined, will not tell you anything, will not safety plan, you just have to do your very cleverest to try to find out where they are. And in my mind, people that talk to us about suicide, there's enough ambivalence there that they've told you. So maybe there's enough ambivalence there that they'll tell you where they are. And they might tell you indirectly, but maybe if you stay with them long enough, they'll agree to go to an emergency room when you think in the beginning they won't. Those are tough people because you desperately want to help and they're not telling you enough to really help them. But no easy answer to that one.
All right. Can you talk a little bit about the letters you receive from the White House periodically? I've had the opportunity to follow up on a few of those. She has, I haven't.
Well, the correspondence that comes to the White House or cabinet members where there's a suicidal content is treated like a third-party call. It happens that the third party is the White House or the third party is the First Lady or something, and this might be an email that they get. So those then get forwarded to SAMHSA, and SAMHSA then makes a decision about sending those on to us, and we in turn send them on to the crisis line who should be working with them.
All right. The 60,000 calls you referenced, was that nationwide for 1 month?
Yes. Mm-hmm. Our network counts these calls, so it's not equally split up among 147 centers. Those in larger cities get more, but that's the total amount of calls that the network got.
And what I think is probably our final question here. She says, how does this presentation differ from the one you'll be giving in Jefferson City? And I think I know the answer to that one. I don't think you're going to be part of the Jeff City conference anymore.
I am not, and I apologize to those of you who thought that I might be. I have now another obligation and so cannot attend the Jefferson City conference and present there. So you've got the only version, and I was delighted that I was going to be able to do this because I was hopeful of, well, at least getting the information to those of you who were interested, and this is going to be available on a long-term basis to those who might even gone to the conference and not been able to attend.
So that was a bonus presentation if you're interested in going to the suicide prevention program at the end of July. What a great segue for the plug for the conference.
There you go.
He was supposed to be a part of that program, but wasn't able to. But if you are interested in that, you're going to be anywhere near the area, click on the link to that. There's more information about that July 29th and 30th in Jefferson City, Missouri. So again, interested in CEUs, the link will stay there, stay active for a little while. We'll also send it to you in an email following the program. Keep tuned to the website. Make sure you're on our email list. Of course, if you registered for this program, if you were part of a larger group, you might not have registered for it. But if you're interested in receiving the emails, you do that through mimhtraining.com. That's how we do most of our publicity these days. It's a lot cheaper than any other way that we can do it. So thank you for your time today. And Lee, thank you for yours.
You're welcome, Tom.
you.